Escape from Sobibor is easily one of the most morally serious and criminally underseen war films ever commissioned for American network television, a production that pulls off the near impossible, transforming documented historical horror into something that feels urgent, dangerous, and viscerally alive, without betraying a single ounce of the truth it is carrying. So, let's take a look behind the scenes of the film with 13 dark facts you didn't know about Escape from Sobibor, including why the man who wrote 12 Angry Men almost turned the commission down flat, the A-list casting pivot that completely rewired the film's emotional center of gravity, and the chilling bureaucratic order that Heinrich Himmler signed in the weeks after the real escape, an order designed to make Sobibor and everyone who died there disappear from the surface of the earth forever. Sobibor was not a concentration camp. That distinction matters enormously, and the film, to its lasting credit, never lets you forget it. Sobibor was one of 3 installations constructed under Operation Reinhardt, the Nazi program commissioned specifically for the systematic extermination of Poland's Jewish population. The other 2 were Treblinka and Belzec. There were no meaningful work details at Sobibor. There was no phased dehumanization over weeks or months. Trains arrived. Prisoners were instructed to undress, surrender their valuables, and walk down a pathway that the camp's SS guards called, with a deliberate, nauseating irony, the Himmelstrasse, the road to heaven. It led directly to the gas chambers. From the moment a transport arrived to the moment its occupants were dead, the process took, on average, less than 3 hours. Historians estimate that between 170,000 and 250,000 Jewish men, women, and children were murdered at Sobibor between the spring of 1942 and the autumn of 1943. The film opens with this context rendered in stark, unsparing title cards. It is the correct choice. It is the only choice. Now, to understand why Escape from Sobibor exists in the form it does, as a major network television event with genuine dramatic weight, you have to go back to 1982 and to an American investigative journalist named Rutger. Rutger had spent the better part of a decade doing something that most of the publishing world considered either impossible or inadvisable, tracking down survivors of the Sobibor escape, a group that, by the early 1980s, was scattered across 3 continents, aging and largely silent. What he had uncovered was extraordinary, one of the largest and most successful prisoner revolts in the entire history of the Nazi camp system, a story so operationally dramatic it bordered on the cinematic, and virtually nobody in the Western world knew it had happened. His 1982 book, also titled Escape from Sobibor, became the foundational document for everything that followed, a work of meticulous, haunting oral history assembled from the testimonies of people who had spent decades trying to process the unprocessable. Without Rutger's obsessive archival pursuit, there is no film. There is no script. There is no story recovered from the silence. So, CBS acquired the rights and commissioned a television adaptation. And for the screenplay, they went to a writer whose name carries an almost totemic weight in the history of American dramatic writing. Reginald Rose was the man behind 12 Angry Men, arguably the most precisely constructed moral drama in the history of American screenwriting, a work so rigorous in its excavation of prejudice, cowardice, and the seductions of lazy thinking that it remains, to this day, a masterclass in what a single room and 12 characters can achieve. By the mid-1980s, Rose was in his 60s and extraordinarily selective about what he agreed to write. The commission for Escape from Sobibor was not reportedly a straightforward decision. The structural and moral challenge Rose faced was almost paradoxical. How do you honor 250,000 dead while simultaneously building a narrative with enough forward momentum to hold a primetime television audience? How do you construct a survival story without implying, even inadvertently, that survival was ever a realistic outcome for the majority of the people in that camp? Rose's answer was to ground the screenplay entirely in documented survivor testimony, to refuse the Hollywood impulse toward invented heroism, and let the historical record carry the dramatic weight. The result is a script that is, in places, almost unbearably restrained. It trusts its audience completely. In 1987 network television, that is a genuinely radical act. However, even the finest screenplay needs the right actors, and the casting of Escape from Sobibor turned out to be a process considerably more complicated than the finished film might lead you to believe. The role of Leon Feldhendler, the underground organizer who had been quietly and patiently building the infrastructure of internal resistance at Sobibor long before a Soviet officer named Pechersky ever set foot inside the camp, went to Alan Arkin. It was, by any measure, a formidable piece of casting. Arkin, at that point in his career, had spent years constructing a reputation for playing men of fierce interior intelligence, characters who are always thinking 3 moves ahead while appearing, on the surface, completely still. Feldhendler is precisely that kind of role, a man whose survival and whose power depends entirely on revealing nothing. Arkin inhabits him with a quiet authority that grounds the entire production. But reportedly, the producers had initially considered a significantly different direction for the role, one that would have leaned into a more overtly emotional register, a version of Feldhendler defined by visible grief rather than contained calculation. That casting path, had it been taken, would have fundamentally altered the film's emotional architecture. Arkin's restraint, as it turned out, was not incidental. It was the performance. Now, if Arkin is the film's moral bedrock, then the man who arrives to electrify everything around him is Rutger Hauer, and his presence in this film tells its own complicated story. By 1987, Hauer occupied a strange and genuinely fascinating position in the industry. 2 years earlier, he had delivered what many critics and filmmakers now consider one of the greatest improvised monologues in cinema history, the Tears in Rain speech at the end of Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, a piece of dialogue that Hauer himself rewrote the night before filming. He was, in other words, an actor of demonstrable and almost alarming creative intelligence. And yet, Hollywood had not entirely figured out what to do with him. He had been deployed, brilliantly and terrifyingly, as a villain in The Hitcher in 1986. But the roles that might have made him a conventional American leading man kept failing to materialize. Escape from Sobibor offered him something genuinely different. Alexander Pechersky, a Soviet Jewish Red Army lieutenant who arrives at Sobibor as a prisoner of war and, within weeks, does something that should have been impossible. He convinces hundreds of traumatized, exhausted, and terrified human beings that they can fight back. Hauer brought to Pechersky exactly what the role demanded: a physical authority that never tips into arrogance and a controlled, burning fury that feels entirely uncomfortably real. He won a Golden Globe for it. He deserved every syllable of the award. So, who else was in the frame for Pechersky before Hauer was confirmed? Rumor has it that several European actors of comparable physical presence and dramatic weight were discussed at the studio level, performers with the kind of command and coiled danger the role required. But the specifics of those conversations have never been made fully public, and Hauer's performance is now so definitive that imagining the role belonging to anyone else is nearly impossible. But here is the detail about the real Alexander Pechersky that the film cannot fully convey, and it may be the darkest irony in this entire story. Pechersky survived the war. He made it back to the Soviet Union, where he was treated not as a hero, but with deep institutional suspicion. Soviet military culture regarded any soldier who had been taken prisoner by the enemy as potentially compromised, tainted by the mere fact of capture, regardless of what he had achieved afterward. Pechersky spent years navigating a bureaucracy that was simultaneously ambivalent about his survival and actively hostile to any historical narrative that centered distinctly Jewish resistance, as opposed to a more palatable story of generic Soviet heroism. He was denied the formal recognition he was owed for decades. He lived in relative obscurity in Rostov-on-Don, worked in an administrative role at a local theater, gave occasional testimony when asked, and was never formally honored by the Soviet state during his lifetime. He died in 1990. Russia did not officially recognize him as a national hero until 2007. The film, made 3 years before his death, plays him with enormous and entirely deserved dignity. The gap between that screen dignity and the reality of how his own government treated him is almost unbearable to sit with. Now, The Escape itself, October 14th, 1943, is the event the entire production is building toward. And the documented facts of what actually happened that afternoon are, even stripped of any dramatization, almost beyond belief. The plan that Pechersky and Feldhendler had devised together was, in its essential mechanics, brutally simple. Lure the SS officers into the camp's workshops, one by one, on the pretext of showing them newly arrived valuables, leather coats, boots seized from incoming transports. Kill them silently, with axes and knives in a precisely staggered sequence timed to the minute so that no alarm could be raised before the next target was already walking through a workshop door. Then cut the telephone lines, seize whatever weapons could be found on the bodies, and walk, not run, toward the main gate as if reporting for an ordinary work call. Then break for the perimeter fences, then run. It is, in its operational logic, the closest thing in recorded Holocaust history to what cinema used to call the Great Escape, except that the Great Escape had the Allied war machine behind it, and Sobibor's prisoners had nothing but desperation in each other. Of approximately 600 prisoners in the camp that day, around 300 made it over or through the perimeter fences. Many were killed immediately in the minefields surrounding the compound. Others were hunted down in the fields and forests in the days and weeks that followed, by German security forces and, in some cases, by local collaborators. Of the 300 who escaped that October afternoon, historians estimate that between 47 and 58 survived to see the end of the war. Every single one of those survivors carried, for the rest of their lives, the specific and devastating weight of having been among the ones who made it. However, what happened to Sobibor itself in the immediate aftermath of the escape is perhaps the most chilling administrative footnote in the entire history of Operation Reinhardt. Heinrich Himmler ordered Sobibor closed, not decommissioned, erased. Within weeks of the October 14th revolt, the camp structures were systematically demolished. The gas chambers were destroyed. The barracks were torn down to their foundations. The ground was plowed. Trees were planted across the entire site. A farmhouse was constructed. By the end of 1943, from the air, from the road, from any external vantage point, Sobibor did not exist. That was precisely the intention. The Nazi command understood with absolute clarity that what had happened at Sobibor, both the industrial murder of hundreds of thousands of human beings and the revolt that exposed it, could not be allowed to leave a physical trace on the landscape. The erasure was designed to be permanent. The film, by existing, by dramatizing the testimonies that Rutger had spent a decade collecting, is itself an act of counter-erasure. That is not a secondary function. That is its deepest and most essential purpose. So, where was the film physically made? Because shooting in Poland in the 1980s during the Cold War, with the Sobibor site now buried under deliberately planted forest, presented considerable logistical and political complications. Production on Escape from Sobibor took place primarily in Yugoslavia under the direction of Jack Gold, a British filmmaker with a strong and serious track record in televisual drama. The Yugoslav terrain, its flat agricultural expanses, its dense tree lines, served as a credible geographic stand-in for occupied eastern Poland. Gold's production design team worked extensively from survivor testimonies and the limited surviving photographic documentation of the camp's layout to reconstruct Sobibor with as much documentary accuracy as a television budget would allow. And that budget was not extravagant. This was network television in 1987, not a studio picture with 8-figure resources behind it. But Gold used those constraints with considerable intelligence, keeping the camera close, keeping the spatial grammar of the camp deliberately claustrophobic, ensuring that the geography always felt like a trap, and never like a set. The absence of Hollywood scale, counterintuitively, makes the film feel more real, not less. Now, one of the most significant decisions Gold and his collaborators made during pre-production was to involve actual survivors of the Sobibor escape in the making of the film, a choice that shaped the production in ways that go far beyond the question of historical accuracy. Several survivors who had been among Rutger's primary interview subjects served as consultants during production. Their involvement created something both remarkable and, at moments, extraordinarily painful to witness. These were individuals being asked to return, imaginatively, emotionally, in full, to the worst weeks of their lives, to verify whether a staged scene felt truthful, to confirm whether a detail of the camp's physical layout matched their memory, to watch actors reconstruct moments that they themselves had lived through, had barely survived, and had spent decades trying to metabolize. Reportedly, the consultations were not easy. There were sessions that required pausing. There were specific details that survivors found too visceral to discuss within the context of a working production. The finished film carries that weight in its bones. You can feel in its most restrained and deliberately unheroic passages the accumulated testimony of people for whom this story was never, in any sense, a drama. But perhaps the single most consequential external force shaping the film's critical reception had nothing to do with the production itself, and everything to do with another documentary that had already, by 1987, permanently altered how serious cinema approached the Holocaust. Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, the 9.5-hour documentary masterpiece that premiered in 1985, had fundamentally changed the grammar of what responsible Holocaust filmmaking was understood to look like. Lanzmann's position, argued with formidable moral authority, was that dramatic reconstruction was ethically incompatible with the scale of what the Holocaust represented, that no actor, no set, no narrative arc could approach the gravity of direct, unmediated testimony. It was a position held in various forms by serious and thoughtful people, and it created a specific critical headwind for Escape from Sobibor upon its release. A suspicion among certain reviewers that the film's genre machinery, its ticking clock dramatic structure, its recognizable Hollywood architecture, was somehow in tension with the seriousness of its subject. However, and this is the essential counter-argument, Escape from Sobibor was seen by an estimated audience of tens of millions across its initial CBS primetime broadcast, numbers that no documentary, however transcendent, was reaching on American network television in 1987. The film put Sobibor on the map for an enormous general audience who had never heard its name. That is not a peripheral achievement. That is arguably the entire point. At the 45th Golden Globe Awards in 1988, Escape from Sobibor won Best Miniseries or Motion Picture Made for Television. Rutger Hauer won Best Supporting Actor. And in the years that followed, the film became a standard educational text in schools and survivor organization programs across Europe and North America, doing precisely what serious historical drama is supposed to do. Not replacing the documentary record, not simplifying it, but opening a door into it for people who would not otherwise have walked through. It was screened in classrooms. It was used by Holocaust memorial institutions as an accessible entry point to the history of Operation Reinhardt for younger generations encountering it for the first time. A television film made on a CBS budget in Yugoslav fields was carrying the memory of Sobibor into living rooms and lecture halls that no academic monograph was ever going to reach. And then, in 2014, the Earth gave up its proof. A team of Polish and Israeli archaeologists conducting excavations at the Sobibor site, beneath the forest that the Nazi command had planted over it in 1943, made a discovery that stopped the academic world cold. They found the gas chambers, intact or near intact, beneath more than 70 years of deliberately cultivated vegetation. The concrete foundations, the corridor systems, the undeniable physical infrastructure of the machinery of mass murder that Himmler's erasure order had been designed to bury permanently. What the archaeologists uncovered in 2014 was not merely archaeological evidence. It was corroboration, written in concrete and Polish soil, of every testimony that Rutger had recorded, that Rose had adapted, that Gold had filmed, that the survivors had carried in their bodies for decades. Sobibor could not be made to disappear. The story could not be erased, and a television film made in Yugoslavia in 1987 on a CBS network budget with Rutger Hauer and Alan Arkin and the words of Reginald Rose had known that, had bet everything on it long before the ground gave up its answer. Upon its initial broadcast, Escape from Sobibor attracted a divided critical response that reflected a genuine and serious debate about the ethics of Holocaust dramatization. Writing in the post-Shoah critical landscape of the late 1980s, television critics at major publications, including John J. O'Connor at the New York Times, who covered the broadcast, acknowledged the film's craft and the strength of its performances while raising pointed questions about whether the story's forward dramatic drive, its genre momentum, and escape thriller mechanics was fully compatible with the moral gravity of what it was depicting. The concern, expressed in various forms across the period's television criticism, was a sincere one, that the conventions of popular narrative might, however, unintentionally aestheticize an atrocity that resisted aestheticization. But nowadays, Escape from Sobibor is widely regarded as one of the most morally serious and historically responsible Holocaust dramas ever produced for a mass television audience. Its survivor consultants endorsed it. Its subject found its way into classrooms and curricula across 2 continents, and the 2014 archaeological discoveries at the Sobibor site, confirming, in physical fact, every detail that Rutger's testimony and Rose's screenplay had committed to screen, only deepened the film's retrospective resonance. It told the truth in the only language that tens of millions of people were going to hear, and the truth, it turned out, was more than enough. But let me know below, when it comes to dramatizing real historical atrocities for a mainstream audience, which side do you come down on? Is a narrative reconstruction a necessary bridge that carries history to people who would otherwise never encounter it? Or does the genre machinery, no matter how carefully handled, inevitably compromise the weight of what it's depicting? And if you enjoyed the video, as always, it would massively help me out if you could leave it a like. And you might also want to check out this video right here.